Okay, hello everyone. It's so nice to see that we have an audience. I wasn't sure on a Friday. So welcome. I'm Professor Adri Thompson, and along with my colleague, Professor Freddie Richmond from the Department of World Languages, we'd like to welcome you to our session. Our students and I are honored to be part of two symposiums today: Sustainable Cities, Campus Learning Community and Symposium, and the 2021 Padrón Teaching and Learning Symposium. First, I'd like to introduce Mike Matthews, the director of the Earth Ethics Institute at Miami-Dade College, and also Dr. Mark Turpak, the Earth Ethics Institute coordinator at the Padrón campus. Thank you both for coordinating this event. And Mike, would you like to say a few words?
Sure, thank you. So good morning, everybody. I would just like to talk a little bit, I guess, first about the campus learning community. With the campus learning community, we look at different themes or topics, and this year we're looking at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 11, which looks at sustainable cities and communities. Within that goal, there's target 11.4, which aims to strengthen efforts to protect and safeguard the world's cultural and natural heritage. So bearing this in mind, I'd like to offer this statement recognizing Miami's original inhabitants. At Miami-Dade College, we acknowledge the indigenous peoples on whose land we stand, the Miccosukee and the Seminole tribes who remain unconquered, and the Tequesta tribe who first occupied the land that is now downtown Miami, and so represent ties to both our prehistoric and historic past. Miami-Dade College is grateful for the unique knowledge and ways of being, as well as a profound connection to our South Florida ecosystems that these indigenous tribes represent. We look forward to strengthening our relationship with both Miami's indigenous peoples as well as the natural world. So we have with the Sustainable Cities Symposium, today is our last day, but there's still, I think, one or two more events for that. And I believe we'll have that link for you in the chat to take a look at, as well as with the Teaching and Learning Symposium. There's, I think, several events happening today. So I encourage all of you in the audience to, if you're able to check out those events. And thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to the talk today.
Thank you. And in addition, I would like to thank the Padrón Teaching and Learning Symposium and our room monitor, Professor Omar Figueres, for coordinating this event. Would you like to say a few words, Omar?
Yes, thank you so much, Adrian, and thank you for having me in the room with you all. Thank you, Mike, for your wonderful words as well in that introduction. I just wanted to remind you all, I teach English literature and creative writing, and for this coming Wednesday, we have a poetry crawl, a live poetry crawl that will be taking place during activities hour at Padrón campus, where 5 poets, 3 professional poets from the Miami area, and 2 student poets will be reading live on camera into a live feed that I'll be directing. It's going to be a lot of fun. Come in, join us. It's going to be great. You have to register at the link. On the day of the event, you will receive a link into the Teams room, so you could just sit back during your lunch and take in some art. Thank you so much for this time.
Thank you. That sounds like fun. So without further ado, our students will share their reflections on the documentary film Seeding Change, which was shown on Wednesday evening through the Sustainable Cities Symposium, hosted by Professor Isabel Duque. She might be here, I think, maybe. Hi, Isabel, shout out if you're here. These students in the ACE program, my students and Professor Richmond's students, they're a special group of students in the English for Academic Purposes program at the Padrón campus. They're part of an accelerated content-based English program called ACE, where they can complete 2 levels of English for academic purposes in 1 semester. Students must be self-motivated learners and academic achievers to participate in this program. So I know they're nervous, but they're very excited to present their reflections with you today. So I have 3 groups of students who will be presenting. And after their presentations, I have a fun Kahoot game based on the film Seeding Change that we can play. And then after that, I'd like to open it up for discussion and questions among all the participants today. So group 1, are you ready? Go ahead and share your screen and we're all ears.
Good morning, everyone. Our presentation is going to be presented by Carla Toledano, Claudette Rowe, Gilbert Cepero, and me, Flor Perez. As you may know, today we're going to talk about In Our Hands film, a film that shows us how farmers in the UK are fighting to create a better food system for everyone.
We can say with any doubt that this film is very moving and it had a positive impact on us with its message. It tells the history behind the terror and frustration of the farmers looking for a better, fair, and sustainable future in the UK. It explains how since the 1980s, the land-based workers have seen a massive surge in the volume of global food trade. Through the film, we learn that the last few years have been a real challenge for the farmers, growers, farmers community, and land-based workers in UK. The documentary shows us that, as the majority of us know, we are living a crucial moment of change for agriculture. We are experiencing a dangerous present where farmers could lose their food sovereignty and family farmers.
In the UK, farmers who made part of the Land Workers Alliance are trying to defend their interests, fighting to create a better food system for everyone. They explain in the video that politicians have enough power to change the way the system works, letting local economies and local farms survive and not become marginalized in a system that is in favor of global trade and speculation. Those farmers are having an impact in their community, coming up with concrete proposals and encouraging biodiversity while increasing the quality and the affordable prices of the food they produce for local shoppers.
Many organizations are bringing together their voices about agroecology and farming without using pesticides and herbicides throughout the process of the agriculture. People are looking for change, climate-friendly farming system, eco-friendly farming system. Organizations like Via Campesina, mentioned during the film, want to see real culture and identity in our food and farming system. I agree with the idea that they don't want low standard prices, but better food and farming system. Everybody cares about good food because we are eating it every single day. We all need a healthy food system, not only in UK, but in all countries around the world. Politicians need to listen to these people instead of going for trade deals that will bring low standard prices, and farmers should be rewarded for farming properly. They should make sure they they and the farmers move together in the same direction. Small and medium farms are not interested in export, but in a strong domestic opportunity for selling their products.
We need to give farmers the opportunity to maintain an adequate livelihood. They are standing up to put a strong focus on the domestic economy, making sure the local supply chain is protected and the small and family farm are viable financially. We saw two interesting concepts in the film, which are organic and fair trade. We learned that organic food has to meet a variety of regulations having to do with how it was produced, including no synthetic fertilizers, antibiotics, hormones, food irrigation, or genetic engineering. What is fair trade? Fair trade is about more than just fair prices. It's also about people and meeting their need today without compromising the need of people in the future. It's an arrangement designed to help producers and uh, and developed countries achieve sustainable and equitable trade relationship. Is also about supporting and challenging businesses and government to make trade fair and inspiring customers to think a bit more about what they buy and from where this product comes.
In conclusion, we think we should be more aware of the food system we want to support and think more about our own health, about the health of the planet and the welfare of the animals. As customers, we make choices on a daily basis, even if most of the time we are not aware of it. 3 times a day, when we are eating our food, we are voting for the food system we want to support. Those farmers take tremendous pride in working the land because it's the way forward to the future. Exactly as mentioned in the film, we stand on the brink. The future is uncertain, but the seeds of better food system are in our hands. So this is our presentation. I hope you like it. We are super happy for you to be here. So thank you for that and have a great day and thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. That was great. Okay, let's move on to group two's reflection.
Hi, good morning. This is group 2. Today we are going to talk about the 6 facts of the movie. We are presenting Ariel Feliu, Elianis Garcia, and Dailenis Núñez.
In our hand was commissioned by the Land Worker Alliance, LWA, a union of small-scale ecological producer, were campaigning for a better agricultural system. The fifth main fact is the movie is the 70% of food is produced in farm, but the farmer and the 30% is produced by machinery. This underpins the film. It is important fact because at the present almost all food is produced by farmers, and we have now created awareness in young people of this. In the future, where is the food that we eat going to come from? In just over a decade, the UK has lost more than 33,000 farms from our countryside. Through history, during World War II, World War I, farmers worked hard to produce food, but the price fell, and they tried to produce even more to pay the debit taxes and living expense. The year 1930s, the situation got worse. Price dropped so low that many farmers went bankrupt and lost their farm. At the time, they were very few left, but today it's worse because people are now aware of where the food comes from. They don't create awareness of the importance of farmers, and they don't know about agriculture. A small scale producer may be the solution to this problem. There are people who don't depend on permanent labor because they have their family for that and dedicate most of their time to manual work at home. They help to protect our planet and the same time support biodiversity. They can also help encourage animal and plant species to recover. So local markets, a small-scale farmer can establish a strong connection with the community by providing fresh produce. Food recently harvested or produced have more nutritional benefits and are therefore healthy. Local food doesn't need to be cheap. This minimizes transport costs, water, energy, and pollution sent out into the environment.
We are losing many of our species, both flora and fauna. It is essential to become aware of this. Millions of species are in extinction due to climate change, change in the form of crops, also due to pets. While negative impacts are serious and can include pollution and degradation of soil, water, and air, agriculture can also possibly impact the environment. For instance, by trapping greenhouse gases within crops and soil, of mitigating flood risks through the adoption of certain farming practices. Habitat diversity per area was increased by the creation of mixed farming landscape. In addition, components of biodiversity in agricultural lands maintain ecosystem services such as pollution, biological pest control, soil and water conservation, nutrients, climatic and climate regulation. Bad diet is now causing more health problems than smoking. When you have a bad nutrition, that can contribute to stress, tiredness, and capacity to work. Also, to the risk of developing some illness and other health problems. We have to ask ourselves where our food comes from. We need farmers to grow our grain, fruits, and vegetables, research to raise castles, chickens, swine, and other value resources, protein, and everything that is part of a good diet. Also, their experience growing the food, full and fever to ensure our way of life continues. The film is a critique of the industrialized food production system in the United Kingdom. It also talks about the organization they have created in order to survive today's technological world, such as Sheffield Organic Grower, who is looking for routes in the market to sell farmers' products. PEPC, which in addition to begin a processing barn, its members benefit from sharing their agricultural equipment as well as street goat. They also talk about each person's right to health, including food, that is a fundamental right to man's livelihood, and it is reflected in Agriculture 25 of the Geneva Convention. A farmer should be respected as a doctor for the work he does to produce food without contaminants for human health. Healthy food should be valued for what they are, workers who oppose bringing food proposed by the food industry to their homes globally.
All progress starts with a taste only nor heart in the store of the farmer who refused to be victim of the history through optimism and hard work. The film celebrates both the experience of the early and the invention of the youth who are working together to provide sustainable agriculture for their communities. The concept of global warming has a great relationship with climate change, but in general, they are two concepts with different meaning. Global warming is due to human activities or early that cause an increase in temperature of the Earth's surface. Climate change is a process that is in the long term and affect factors such as temperature, precipitation, and others. The documentary that we are devoting has a broad relationship with this concept since after industrialization was introduced in the agriculture sector, it can be seen how the different changes in the environment will take place, soil, climate, human health, etc. With the introduction of all these fossils in agriculture, change began to occur in the land and environment. Global warming and climate change are controversial topics. Concerns about phenomena have inspired growth like the one we see in the documentary to seek alternative means to those used today that are less aggressive and more natural. In the textbook about American history, we can see how through the decades such as in 1960s, 1970s, and 1980, they focus on seeking international environment movement. Among these movements, we can see the creation of the World Wildlife Fund, WWF, in Switzerland in 1961, Greenpeace in Canada in 1971. In June 1972, the United Nations, UN, held its first conference on the human environment in Stockholm, Sweden. After this conference, the UN created the United Nations Environment Programme. In the last 2 decades, the global environment movement has grown based on the old international environment movement of the 1960s. With environment treaties and World Summit, climate change has become the major international problems. How can agriculture adapt? Adaptation strategies are short and long-term changes to human activities that respond to the effect of change in climate. In agriculture, adaptation will require the cost-effective investment in water infrastructure, emergency preparation for and response to extreme weather events, development of resilient crop varieties that tolerate temperature and precipitation stress, and new or improved land use management practice. This is the reference. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great job. Excellent. I forgot to mention in my introduction that all of my students are also taking an American history class from the Civil War to the present. And I asked them to relate some of the content from their textbook and their class to their presentation. So that's why the last group mentioned something about American history. So thank you, great job. Okay, our last group is group 3. And we have Leonel and Yasser. And Jauska couldn't be here today because of work, because we normally meet Mondays and Wednesdays, but her audio portion of the presentation, I think, is inserted in their PowerPoint. So go ahead and share your screen, and we're ready.
Good morning, everyone. We are the group number 3, and we will be presented by Jauska Lazo, Eric Licona, and me, Leonel Barahona. The first question is identify the people. We identify the land worker is a person who works on the land. The next is dairy farmers. The dairy farmer is a charge of all operations necessary to produce milk and milk products for commercial sales and consumption. He breeds and raises dairy cows. Farmer is a person who cultivates lands or crops or raises animals. Seed collector represents the greatest concentration of living seed plant diversity on Earth. Food processor is the handling or processing of any food in any manner of operation for sale for human consumption. A forester is a person in charge of forests or skilled in planting, managing, or carrying to even events or aspects of people. The video shows how the people enjoy the work in their own lands, helping the community with product cultivation. Also, we can observe that they have a passion for their growth. Different types of events occur during the process, but what is the important is that can you see a connection between their job and their co-worker. The farmer still wake up early and spend their days doing hard, generally labor-intensive work. There are animals to feed, cows to be milked, and fields to be plowed, regardless of the improvement to the equipment to help the job done. Farm life still requires a lot of commitment and sacrifice. The next slide was going to be presented by Jauska, but she's not here, but we have the audio of her presentation, okay?
Good morning, everyone. I tell about places that appears in the movie. In our hands is the history of a new kind of farm, a new kind of food, and a new kind of society. As place, we can see various farms with agriculture and livestock. The farmers are members of the International Peasant Union. and they work in solidarity with fellow land workers around the world. So now I talk about Nature, that is the focus of this film. This film was created in a farm environment. In it we can appreciate a little about the work of farmers and food workers. These farm workers are creating vibrant farms, living soil, and a fairer food system for everyone.
I'm going to talk about the ecology in the US history. By 1960s, the damage to the natural world from post-war population and economic growth was becoming hard to ignore. Water pollution was becoming so widespread that almost every major city was dealing with an unpleasant sight and odor, as well as the health risks of polluted rivers and lakes. Changing environment were now too hard to ignore, and because of that, scientists much of the world began to create a new rationale for environmentalism. They call it ecology. The environment was not an issue to be discussed until President Richard Nixon considered an environmental policy in one of his speeches. Soon after, he created the first Earth Day in April 1970. And in June, he announced the formation of the Environmental Protection Agency. Thanks, our sources. Thank you very much for your.
Okay, thank you. You all did a great job. This is their first time, I'm sure it's their first time presenting in a public arena and online. So great job, guys. Put this on your resume.
Good job. Good job.
I know it's hard, and especially I'm very proud of my students because many of them haven't been in the United States that long, and they're speaking in their second language, and they did an excellent job. So kudos. So that's our presentation today. I'm going to open it up for questions or comments. I know we only have about 5 minutes left of our session time, but I'd just like to open it up to anyone.
Hi. I was wondering if the students have any comments about this approach that you've used of them doing the presentations and how that works as a way to learn, if they thought that would work for them, or
Okay,
what their feelings were about it.
Question. So my students, do you have any comments about this experience? They watched the movie, and then I gave them some concepts to choose from, to talk about from the movie, and some discussion questions to choose from. And then I wanted them to relate it to their American history class in some way. So does anyone in my class want to comment about this experience? How do you feel about your experience making the presentation? You can be honest, it's okay. Do you want to comment about your experience today?
Yes, it was super great. I'm super proud of my classmate. I want to say thank you, Professor, for your time with us to teach us everything, literally. You're patient with us too, because our English is not perfect, but we are trying to, to improving, and you are a perfect help for that. I'm super grateful with you and with my classmates for all our effort that we
that you made.
Exactly, that we made for the presentations, and everything is thanks to you, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'll be asking you some open-ended questions in a survey that will be anonymous later, so maybe I'll get other feedback, but I'm glad that it sounds like you had a good experience. I usually do this every semester with my students, but we've never had such a large audience before. Usually it's just us, maybe a couple of professors, and maybe Mike or Mark, come to the session. So this was really kind of exciting to do it online and having so many people observe us. Plus it's being recorded for posterity. So that's also something new.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carla.
Thanks.
Does anyone else want to say anything?
Thank you, Professor, for everything through the semester. Was good. that helped me to improve my English so much. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Diley. Okay, any
Thanks,
other?
Professor.
We don't have to.
Can I say something?
Yeah, okay, Ariel.
Thank you, thank you. This was a very beautiful experience, one that should be repeat on another occasion. Thank you for thank you for the present to the teacher, and especially to the teacher, the Professor Eri. Thank you.
Thanks, Ariel. It takes a lot of courage, to speak in front of so many people. And I know it was an assignment, you didn't have a choice really, but you guys did it. Great job. Anyone else? Any reflections or comments or feedback about the topic or anything?
The experience was good. I think we were a little nervous because it is our first time, but I am very happy with everyone's work.
You did a great job. Thanks, Eliana.
Thank you.
Good job. Anyone what about our participants? Does anyone want to have a comment or any of the other students from the other classes? Maybe if you saw the documentary or if you have some comment, please feel free to share.
Well, I want to say
Carmen,
something.
yeah.
Yeah, hi everyone.
Hi.
I want to say something. This is the last day of the symposium, and it's just been amazing. All the presenters, all the student presentations, my students here are in my ENC 1102 honors class, and we're doing something similar, looking at food. We saw Food Inc. and Cowspiracy in our class. I'm definitely going to use this film, next term that I teach this class. And to all your students, you guys did an amazing job. And like Professor Figuera said, you should be very proud of yourselves to get up and speak in front of an audience, and then to do it here like virtually, where it's like it feels like even more stressful than like face to face because of the technology. And you guys did such a wonderful amazing job. And Alexa's my student, she won 3rd place. Congratulations. A lot of the questions, the things that we talked about in our class as well. And so good job everyone. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much for bringing your class. All right, well, I guess we'll end the session. Thank you so much to the participants, to the students, to the professors, and everyone who came to the session today. Have a great weekend, and yeah, let's take care of our environment and think about the food we eat, especially.
Thank you, Adri, for participating in the symposium, or I guess both symposiums.
Okay, bye everyone.
Bye, Professor.
Bye.
Bye, Professor.
Bye, everyone.
you.
Thank you.